A few weeks ago, we got the reveal that Ragnir is a hammer with a devil fruit, and that immediately drags up one of the oldest unanswered questions in One Piece. How can inanimate objects eat devil fruits? For years, we've accepted that wording without much pushback, but at this point, Oda's refusal to explain the process suggests the issue isn't missing information, it's that we've been using the wrong framework entirely. The first thing we have to do here is just to be honest. The phrase objects eat devil fruits is completely batshit insane. The only reason we even say it is because that's the wording that Oda handed to us, and we've all been nodding along like this makes sense. And at this point, in the absolute apocalypse year that is 2026, I think most of us have quietly realized that we were given a placeholder, a linguistic duct tape solution meant to stop us from asking the obvious follow-up questions. Because of that, I don't think that the mystery is how objects eat devil fruits at all. The issue is the framework itself. Eat was never doing any real helpful work here. And if that's true, then the series hasn't been vague for over 20 years. It's been misleading us on purpose. It's worth pointing out just how long Oda has avoided explaining this, because we've got decades of examples at this point. Funkfried, Lasso, Smiley, Shamrock Sword, and now Ragnir. And every time, the process is treated like a locked vault. There's no, here's how it works, not even a fake explanation we're meant to picture. It feels intentional, and now that we're in Elbaf, where Oda is stacking multiple sentient weapons into the same arc like it's nothing, that reads less like coincidence and more like a pause before explanation. When an explanation gets avoided this consistently, that's usually a sign the question itself is framed wrong. Calling the process eating pushes everything towards biology, and there's cases in One Piece where power is never treated that way. Sometimes it's metaphysical, wills get inherited, dreams carry forward, Haki reacts to intent. Oda applies that same logic to objects consistently. The breath of all things, the Kobartaman, cursed blades, swords with personalities that reject users or drain them on purpose. None of that is metaphor, that's just how the world functions. Cursed blades don't act the way they do because of spooky magic nonsense, they just act the way they do because will and intent were poured into them during their creation and use, and the story treats that as a mechanical rule. So when an object ends up with a Zoan devil fruit, the process may not resemble actual consumption. It could resemble transference. The object becomes a container for something that already wants to be alive. That also explains why it's always zones. Zones already come with a will and already blur the line between user and power. So if a devil fruit is going to attach itself to something that isn't alive yet, those are the only ones that make sense. Which means the real question was never, how did a sword eat a fruit? It's more like, what kind of object can actually accept the will of a zone in the first place? This is usually the point where Vegapunk becomes the assumed explanation. That assumption comes directly from the story. After Enies Lobby, it's stated that Vegapunk developed a method that allows devil fruits to be applied to inanimate objects. Over time, that line hardened into consensus. Saying Vegapunk figured it out suggests a single moment of discovery. It implies a clean breakthrough. However, that interpretation starts to break down when you look at the timeline. Vegapunk's active research period spans a few decades. Ragnir, meanwhile, has existed for centuries. If an inanimate object had a devil fruit long before Vegapunk's era, then the method enabling that outcome had to exist earlier as well. Vegapunk didn't pull this out of his ass. He's just duct taping an old gaming setup back together with half the parts missing. And that framing lines up with how Vegapunk describes his own work on Egghead. He says outright that he isn't advancing beyond the present, he's trying to catch up to the past. Much of his research is based on remnants from the ancient kingdom. After Ohara's destruction, Vegapunk studied the salvaged books in Elbaf. That recovered knowledge becomes the foundation of his later projects. The Mother Flame is the clearest example. Vegapunk calls it an incomplete reproduction of a power source that already existed long before him. And with that context in place, it becomes possible to talk about how devil fruits might be bound to objects. To talk about how devil fruits are capable of being eaten by objects. The explanation is more complex than the word eat, but it fits the way One Piece has always handled inherited knowledge and incomplete understanding. So before getting into how this might works, it's worth acknowledging something up front. In canon, when a devil fruit user dies, the power doesn't disappear. It leaves the body and reincarnates into a nearby fruit. That at least suggests devil fruit abilities aren't permanently tied to the user even after death. And this is where the Vegapunk explanation of feeding objects devil fruits isn't actually about feeding at all. Instead, they behave more like an essence that's released when certain conditions are met, and the most consistent condition we're shown is death. So when an object is said to have eaten a devil fruit, it's not hard to wonder whether that wording is doing more than it should. Rather than literal consumption, it may be closer to the fruit being forced into the state where it can no longer retain its power. In other words, the fruit is dead. In that framing, the object isn't being fed, the fruit is being broken as a container. If that's even partially true, the fruit would need to be isolated, the release triggered intentionally, the surrounding environment arranged so the essence has only one viable place to go. Otherwise, based on what we already know, the power would most likely just reincarnate into the nearest available fruit. And from that angle, the more interesting question stops being how to force the essence out and starts being what kind of object can even receive it. If preventing immediate reincarnation is the real bottleneck, then the setup becomes the critical piece. For this to work, the release would likely need to happen in a controlled space. No nearby fruits, no living bodies. Once free, the essence would presumably move forward to the closest viable host. There's also a second limitation that seems important. Whatever forces a devil fruit to release its essence would probably be destructive to the fruit itself. If the same conditions were applied directly to the object meant to inherit that essence, the object could be damaged or destroyed as well. And this applies some kind of separation, insulation, containment, maybe even protective bubble coatings or barriers, since Vegapunk is a genius when it comes to making bubbles. The fruit takes the damage, the object stays close enough to receive whatever is released, but shielded from the process that breaks the fruit down in the first place. And what really pushed this line of thinking into focus for me was Zeus. Not because Zeus involves a devil fruit, but because the mechanics look similar. When Big Mom orders Hera to eat Zeus, Zeus's original body is on the verge of being cooked. His essence is about to be absorbed by Hera. At the same time, Nami's climate tag is present, an object that's been heavily modified, used constantly, and turned specifically for weather and lightning. It's essentially been functioning as an extension of Zeus already, his McDonald's. When Zeus's soul needs somewhere to go, it doesn't go to any random place. It moves into the climate tag, and after that, Zeus is bound to it. The climate tag stops being a tool and starts functioning like a body for a soul, because that's what it's doing actually. So to me, that scene suggests souls can be displaced without death. Objects can act as prepared vessels, and non-living things can serve as proxies for will. And if those rules already exist for souls, then applying a similar logic to Zoan devil fruits doesn't feel out of place. It feels like the same framework applied one layer deeper. Which raises the next question. What makes an object capable of receiving something like that at all? One Piece has quietly established that some objects can accumulate intent, will, or presence over time, and this lines up neatly with the Japanese concept of yorishiro, objects prepared to retract a spirit through sustained use, intention, and purpose. When a spirit inhabits such an object, it becomes a shintai, a physical body. Weapons forged with extreme intent and used over long periods start behaving differently. They reject users, they drain hockey, they develop personalities. The story consistently treats these traits as literal mechanics and not symbolism. So rather than supernatural curses, these objects seem shaped by accumulated will. And by the time a weapon reaches that kind of status, it arguably isn't an empty container anymore. It has presence. So if a devil fruit essence were released and looking for somewhere to go, it wouldn't necessarily attach to something random. It would plausibly be drawn toward an object already capable of holding intent and will. From that perspective, the object isn't being given a soul, it's demonstrating that it can function as a substitute body. The process resembles inheritance or occupation more than consumption. Cursed blades, Clobotermen, inanimate objects that eat Zoan devil fruits start looking less like unrelated anomalies and more like variations of the same underlying rule. And once you look at it this way, a lot of older cases stop feeling random. The important part is this. No one needs to understand the entire process, they only need to stumble into one part of it. So take Caesar Clown. Caesar didn't need to understand the full process. He had access to Punk Hazard after it was abandoned, Vegapunk's old labs, leftover research, half-finished experiments. On top of that, it wouldn't be surprising if he specializes in sealed environments, chemical forcing, and accelerated decay through gas, especially the last one. It makes him uniquely suited to brute force one specific step, breaking the fruit as a container, just triggering the process of death and hoping something nearby catches the essence. Mr. 4 falls into a similar category. He doesn't need to have deep knowledge of the technology, because when you think about it, devil fruits move through the underworld, and Crocodile himself operated within those networks. So it wouldn't be surprising if Mr. 4 himself also ran through the underworld and came in contact with Caesar Clown, especially since Caesar Clown himself is a seller within the underworld. Spandam and Shamrock are even more straightforward. World government resources, Vegapunk's pipeline. Wano is a different case because Wano is completely isolated from everywhere else. But there is centuries of swordsmith culture, tools forged with intent, objects treated as extensions of people. like blades. In an environment like that, an object that already carried a Zoan Devil Fruit, like the Tanuki Teapot, it wouldn't seem as impossible. None of these cases require everyone to understand the rules, they only require the rules to exist and for different people to stumble into different parts of them. And if these are the rules Oda's been working with, then Ragnir suddenly matters a lot more, especially once you start looking at where Elbaf is headed and who Luffy would even end up clashing in the final battle, which I talk about in this video here.